Greetings, I am Shad, and in this video I'll be taking a very close look at the city Solitude from the Elder Scrolls V Skyrim. The way I go about in reviewing castles and fortifications from video games, movies, and TV series is to see if these structures would be realistic and or effective if they actually existed, and how much of their design conforms to accurate medieval fortifications. The first thing that I have to mention is the very first thing that I had to mention in my review of Whiterun, and that is the size. Realistically, according to its size, Solitude is absolutely not a city. It's barely a small village. If it existed in real life, this would be a secured commune, or just a flat-out castle. It would be a very large castle, but it's actually a good representation of a large castle, because a castle wasn't always a single structure. Now, yes, sometimes they were just a single building, sometimes they were a building with a wall around it, and the building I'm referring to is the main livable portion, which is called the keep. But oftentimes there would be many other buildings in it as well. They would have a chapel, they would have a blacksmith, they would have stables, they would have buildings for storage, sometimes they would even have kind of fenced-off areas to keep animals. They would have vegetable gardens and just nice pretty gardens. There could be a large variety of different buildings within castle walls, and there's actually no limit. Whatever the people who lived in the castle wanted to have, and there was room for, they would put it in. A good example of this is Ville Castle, and I know I butchered the pronunciation, alright, you don't need to tell me, or in German, Ordensburg Jandy. This was a castle that belonged to the Livonian Brothers of the Sword, which was like a crusader order of knights. Here is a model recreation of the castle, and just take a look at how many buildings are actually part of the overall structure. There was a chapel, an administration building, a separate residence for the commander that later became a storeroom, a granary, a living quarters for the clergyman, a stable for the clergyman, a separate building for the dining room, storeroom, stables, and additional servants' quarters. You see, so castles could actually have a lot of buildings inside them. Therefore, if Solitude was just considered a very large castle, well, it would be a castle that would have an inn, a couple of shops, a dedicated blacksmith, a full-on big barracks, a cathedral, a palace. But that is actually all very feasible. And so I actually consider the whole of Solitude a fairly good representation of a very big castle. But not a city. Nowhere near the size of a city. Now, with size out of the way, we need to address the elephant in the room, and that is this thing. The stone bridge in which about a third of the castle, I'm just going to refer to a castle, because realistically that's what it is more like than a city, but a third of the castle is sitting on this stone bridge, and the palace is on the other end of it. Okay, this thing is flat out defying the laws of physics. Now, some of you might be disagreeing with me because you've seen other stone-like formations. Well, I'm not saying that stone formations like this can't exist, but when they do, it is because they are actually conforming to an archway. But what we're looking at here isn't an archway. It could have been, it almost is, but it isn't. You see, the compressive strength of stone is phenomenal. Think of all the large mountains in the world and what they're resting on. It's stone. And the weight that you're talking about when you look at these mountains, it's mind-boggling. The quality in which stone really falls behind is tensile strength. So compressive strength is things being pushed together, and tensile strength are things being pulled apart. If you can engineer any structure that is made out of stone to rely on compressive strength, it'll be very reliable. But if you engineer a structure that's built out of stone that relies on tensile strength, you're in for a disaster. And looking at this stone bridge, there are so many areas in which the weight of it is not pressing down on other stone. And if there is no support for that stone to rest upon, well, it's going to be pulling down on the stone next to it, which means the stone bridge will come under tension and not compression, and the people living on this thing are not going to be very happy. But in reality, it just never would have even formed for people to build things on in the first place. This bridge would need to have this type of shape, which puts all the sides and everything under compressive strength, redirecting it into the sides and into the ground. You need to redirect the load into the ground. And if that happened, well, it could have actually been quite stable. Because stone has such incredible compressive strength, the more weight you put on it can actually make it more stable, to a certain level. So I'm not saying Solitude could not have achieved a kind of stone bridge archway, but it would have needed to have been in the correct shape, and what we see here is completely the opposite. The stone base on the other end easily looks strong enough to be able to support the weight of the palace atop it. We have many examples in real life of thin kind of looking stone formations in which structures have been built atop. The question that would come next is, would this stone base be vulnerable to being destroyed from bombardment or even the magic that exists in the world? In my own opinion, I think the stone base that we're looking at here, if it had a proper arch and everything was stable, would actually be too stable then for it to be destroyed in a practical length of time through bombardment, and the spells and dragonfire that we see in Skyrim don't seem particularly destructive, and that could be a limit in the game mechanics as they didn't want to do destructive environments. But no, you could not easily destroy this stone base or the archway if it had a proper archway, because there would be so much weight pressing down and compressing on all the sides that would actually be very, very stable. And if that was achieved, that would have made Solitude's position glorious. So just pretend for a moment that the bridge had a proper kind of archway structure underneath and everything was stable. This position would just be perfect. A third of the city, including the palace, looks to be way too high for effective bombardment from trebuchets. You can't get at it with a siege tower or ladders or anything like that. In fact, there is only one logical direction of approach, and that is the front gate. But there is a problem, and that is the mountain or cliff face to its left side. This really does seem to be quite popular in fiction. We saw it with Helm's Deep in Lord of the Rings, we saw it with Kaer Morhen in The Witcher, and now we see it here on Solitude in Skyrim. Now, I'm not saying it was never done. Prajama Castle in Slovenia is a perfect example of this. But I do feel that a castle being built so close to a high mountain or cliff face are inherently vulnerable to certain things, like rockfalls for one. I don't think it's the best choice. And the fact that so few historical castles were ever built hugging tall high mountains gives me the impression that the people who built castles in the medieval period agreed with me. Because it could have been done. There are a lot of mountains in the world, a lot of cliff faces, and castles could have been built right hugging them, but no. The first choice that I see in all the castles that I've studied is in height and elevation, and not having anything nearby it that is taller than the castle. And in regards to Solitude specifically, access to the mountain on the side doesn't seem that difficult. You could easily go around, which means you could engineer some kind of landslide or rockfall, which could do some serious damage to the castle below. The next part, and I really have to give Solitude a big tick in regards to this, is its overall layout. Looking at it from a bird's eye view, what do we see here? We see internal divisions. In fact, 5 internal divisions. There are 3 main baileys with 2 lesser kind of inner baileys or inner wards. It even has a secondary outer wall or gate, which is just awesome. But we'll have a closer look at these gatehouses, and I say that, with great hesitation because they're actually not gatehouses. But looking at Solitude's basic layout overall, it is beautiful. Another wonderful thing about this layout is that the barracks is completely divided and walled off. There are even parts of the wall that are subdivided from other parts of the wall, meaning you have to go through something like a tower which can be blocked off before reaching another part of the wall. This is a very sound design in regards to castle defenses. And Solitude does it! Huge tick! Wonderful! Awesome! In regards to the Blue Palace, you might be thinking that I have a lot of issues with it because there are no fortifications on it at all. Well, I actually don't have any issues with it because the location of the Blue Palace actually gives it enough of a defensive advantage that it doesn't really need any battlements on it. This can be a full-on palace as it is without having any real issues. A great real-world example of a castle that has such incredible outward defenses that the main structure or building at its center enter doesn't need to be very fortified is Hochostovitz Castle. Now, Hochostovitz, which is, as best as I can pronounce it, has 14 gatehouses, alright? Just look at the path one has to follow to get up to this incredible plateau that the castle is situated on. What a location! It is just stunning. But what's really interesting about this castle is the main habitable building. If you were to take away all the outer walls and just look at the building by itself, it would be kind of hard to pick this out as a castle. It has some kind of tower-ish protrusions, but they're not fortified, they don't have any battlements atop them. In fact, the entire building has no battlements on it. It also has very large windows that are facing the outside. The main habitable part of Hochostovitz Castle is pretty much a classic medieval style building with no actual embattlements on it. You wouldn't consider it by itself a castle, but the thing is it doesn't need heavy embattlements because of all the excessive fortifications around it and its position. It's so high and secluded that trebuchets or anything like that couldn't get close enough to bombard it, which would also mean, and I'm deducing this from the windows, because you can kind of look at the type of windows from the outside looking at it, that the walls are probably not the necessary meter or 2 meters thickness that castle walls are supposed to have. Again, it doesn't need it because of its location and all the other outer defenses surrounding it. So we can take these lessons from Hochostovitz and compare it to Solitude, specifically the Blue Palace. The outer wall of Solitude runs around the outside of the Blue Palace already, so that's defenses enough. Then its position is so commanding that it is basically perfectly defended from bombardments or anything like that, and in regards to the layout, it is one of the furthest most buildings from the main entrance. And if all the divisions had proper defenses, so we're talking gatehouses, alright, portcullises, murder holes, arrows, and all that stuff, it would be a nightmare to try and reach the palace going through all those defenses. Which means the Blue Palace doesn't really need to have too many defenses on it. It could. I don't really think there's such thing as overkill when it comes to castle defenses. You want a castle to be as capable as possible to be able to repel attackers. But that doesn't mean a castle has to have defenses on every single point it can possibly feasibly have, because castles served other purposes as well. They were centres of government, and in that sense, yeah, there's a lot to like about the Blue Palace. Solitude has an outer bailey, which is really good, okay? You need to get through one wall and then a secondary wall before you enter the city proper. The issue here is that they actually don't have gatehouses on them at all. They just have gates. Thankfully, the gates have doors. One has kind of like an iron grate. The other has a full-on iron big door, which looks very defensible. But no portcullis, no drawbridges, and no defenses on the inside of the gate. As you're actually going through the wall, okay, it's a passage of about 2 to 3 meters. No defenses there at all, which is a huge missed opportunity because these walls are easily thick enough to have a gate on each end, a front gate and a back gate. And if they had that, once the enemy got through the first gate, they'd be trapped in the middle, and this is where murder holes and arrow slits would just be perfect, but they're non-existent. They're not there at all. The other really odd thing about Solitude's outermost gate, it has these 2 kind of stone walls right on top of the gate itself. This is profoundly stupid for a very important reason. When an enemy is attacking this wall, which part of the wall do you reckon they're going to be most located to? You guessed it, the gate. That'll have the largest concentration of bad guys who are trying to get in the city. So therefore, the best place that you could stand and try and fire down on the enemy is directly above the gate. But there's a wall. There's a wall in the way, stopping you from firing down at the most likely position where the bad guys are going to be. It is the worst thing you could have above a gate. At the very least, you would want crenellations to be able to duck behind and shoot down, but these crenellations should actually be extended outwards to create matriculations, which would provide openings directly above the gate that you can drop large rocks, fire arrows down right on the people who are trying to break it down. So again, this part, not only are the proper fortifications missing, they have a structure here that is serving the exact opposite to what is needed. It makes it more difficult to be properly defended. Utterly nonsensical in castle-like fortifications and designs. Ridiculous. Now, of course, the next big problem here is the complete lack of crenellations. In fact, this is one of the lowest barriers I have seen on any castle-like structure. I mean, I called out Helm's Deep for having a barrier that only came up to waist height. This only comes up to your knee! Utterly stupid. There is no cover here for defenders at all. And the odd thing about this is that in some other parts on the walls, they actually have Merlon-like extensions that would provide cover for someone atop them. But on most other locations on the wall, nothing. Barely even a barrier to prevent people from falling off. It's just hopeless. So these are some pretty darn big glaring problems, but, oh gee, we're not done yet. The next huge problem is the thickness of the walls on the towers. In my review of Kaer Morhen from The Witcher, I pointed out how pathetically thin the walls were on some of the towers, but these ones are even worse! They're about half as thick as the walls on Kaer Morhen, and would not stand up to a single shot from a trebuchet or the like. These towers would be so easily demolished. Now, in contrast to the towers, the thickness of the walls themselves are actually really good. The problem is, and the thing that so many people miss, is that the tower walls, and the walls of really any other structure that is facing the outside of the castle, needs to be adequately thick as well to survive potential bombardment. And the minimum thickness, is about 1 meter, but really, most castles, 2 meters at least. Now, remember how I mentioned that Solitude's overall layout was really, really good, and it is. The thing that completely undermines this wonderful layout is the fact that the walls dividing each part of this castle have no gates or barriers on them at all. They're just archways. You can't even see provision that something might be there. Just nothing. Utterly hopeless. And this glaring omission exists on every single internal division. The division from the first large external bailey to the barracks, from the first outer bailey to the noble quarter, nothing. From the barracks to the noble quarter, nothing. From the noble quarter to the palace, nothing. From the barracks to the cathedral, nothing! At best, these divisions will bottleneck an enemy if they ever breach the outer walls, but that is not enough. All the enemy has to do is push hard enough and they will get through these archways easy. And here's another example of that massive, mind-boggling, stupid design feature that they had on the outermost gate, where that wall was blocking the very, place you needed to be able to fire back on enemies. Well, on the wall dividing the outermost bailey to the barracks, there is a huge wall blocking any type of view or anything from the gate below, the wall below, and the actual bailey that extends from it. You can't fire into that bailey, you can't fire down onto anyone trying to get through the gate underneath. And I mean, it could have worked well if they had arrow slits or something in there, but there's nothing, it's just a wall blocking you off completely. So yes, there is some massive mistakes in regards to the finer points of Solitude's defenses. It feels like I'm being fairly harsh on Solitude, but I'm just being honest, okay? There are some real nonsensical parts about its design if we look at it from a realistic and practical perspective. But there are things that I love about the city, like the stuff I mentioned at the beginning of this video, and I will say that the overall aesthetic, the kind of architecture shown in the design of the buildings and the stone structures themselves, I really like. I particularly like the cathedral. Not because it looks particularly cathedral-like, it doesn't, but because it looks particularly castle-like, and it fits so well in with the design aesthetic of everything else. It is just a cool-looking building. Now, having addressed all these points, what is my conclusion about Solitude's overall defenses? Well, ultimately, I have to rate it as totally impossible because of the fact that it's defying the laws of physics in its location, and that in my mind makes it even worse than Whiterun, but if we were to pretend that that issue wasn't there, or that this stone bridge had a proper structural arch that it could support itself, well then that would make it much better than Whiterun because of its commanding position, though it does have that problem with the side mountain. Its walls are certainly better than nothing, but they provide basically no cover for anyone atop the walls, or way too much cover to the point that anyone on the walls can't fire back. And of course we have the thin walls of the towers. So unfortunately Solitude's defenses are quite poor. poor. They're better than nothing, but because of these serious mistakes on the finer parts of its defences, it would be far easier for someone to assault this castle. From engineering rock slides from the side mountain to being able to scale the walls that are near the side mountain because the mountain provides elevation and perch to try and get atop them, to bombarding the weak parts on these thin-walled towers, to having barely a lip at all on the sides of the walls, to just raising ladders and other things to climb atop them, and then of course not having any doors or grates blocking the archways through the internal divisions of the castle. All of these points are very serious issues. Solitude trips at the finish line. It had a great foundation that could have made excellent defenses, and then it just falls apart. And in the end, it's not that great. So there you go. That is my review of the city, though I like to consider it just a large castle, Solitude from the Elder Scrolls Skyrim. Thank you for watching. I hope to see you again, and until that time, farewell.